doing? Can we improve our interventions? Can we improve our overall strategy? How do we improve our capacity? That requires impact or measurement of outcomes, but it requires us to go underneath the hood of the car or underneath the water line and see a little bit more deeper what's happening and why. So it's allows us to go deeper. The third reason we might want to gather impact is to make strategic choices, high level decisions about sustaining, winding down, or scaling an initiative. This is sometimes called summative evaluation. And this actually requires us to do even more than the first two. We often have to do really good long-term tracking. We have to do a really good job on contribution analysis. We often have externals come in and help us with a little bit of that assessment because we might be too close to provide a fair and unbiased judgment. And that is another use of data. Now, all of these things are important, but here's what we are focusing on this series and here's what we're not focusing on. We're simply trying to get the foundational stuff done. Why? Because we need to do that for the other two pieces of work. And those other two pieces of work are important, but they're beyond our ability to present that in a very short 6-month series where we're spending 1 hour a month together. So we may want to go deeper with that impact assessment or tracking impacts with your coaches, but that's out of scope for our mission of simply getting an impact report done by autumn. If people want to go deeper on strategic learning and summative evaluation, etc., there's a website that's the best website in the world called Better Evaluation, and it is thick with good tools and techniques. They're not adapted to poverty reduction. You'd have to do that on your own, but that's the most extensive place you can go online for free tools and lots of examples. So do take a look at that site if you haven't done it already. Now let's get into these 12 principles to guide your effort. And again, these are foundational ideas that create kind of the infrastructure, the lenses for us to start tackling all those different outcome and impact challenges that we're going to explore in the next phase. And the reason I want to start with principles is this is actually a cartoon that's meant to be of me. And it was done in 1996, I think. And it's spooky about how accurate the cartoon is around how I look now. And that's meant to be me. And I had it done for a magazine article I was editing an edition on evaluation for called Making Waves. And the point I was making in the editorial was when I started evaluation, I fixated on metrics, tools, techniques, indicators, and methods. I thought that was the answer to evaluation. However, I was young and I fixated on recipes and numbers, etc., without a real understanding of perspectives and principles. And I contributed to what we see in most evaluations. People use methods and generate data, but they don't actually have basic principles and interpretive lenses with which to use that data. And therefore, we create abundant noise, abundant data, where we're data rich but sense making poor. So that's something we want to address right up front to say we will get into metrics and tools and techniques in the next workshop, but we're going to start off with perspectives and principles. And here's 12 principles. Don't know why we chose 12. It sounded biblical, but it turned out that we felt all 12 were necessary. That I'm going to walk through fairly quickly now with a couple of examples. And then what we're going to do is, as we're walking through this, it's going to be a lot, everyone, so hold on. But these principles are going to pop up again and again in the rest of the modules. So your mission for the next 15, 20, 25 minutes is to just get an impression of these things, to feel them. And then we'll ask which ones resonate with you most and why, and which ones don't. So let's start with the first one, which is principle number 1. Be clear with everyone, including yourself, about the purpose of your measurement effort, because it's going to influence the methods, resources, and expertise we'll need to get it done. I'm going to play with you a little bit here. I'm expanding that pyramid a little bit with another kind of use, but strategic choices, strategic learning, and tracking and communication. Those are the ones we've talked about before. You will often be approached by other organizations who want to do field building work. They want to develop knowledge about what do we know about poverty reduction in general, and what do we know about collective impact efforts to tackle poverty or community-wide efforts. That is yet another use, and it has its own implications about how to go about it. Now, for us, for the purpose of this series, we want to monitor to provide innovators a sense of progress, communicate to the community, and use it for routine reporting to funders. That means we need roughly right data that is easy to gather, analyze, and easy to communicate. If we were going deeper and we were doing these other things, as mentioned earlier, we would actually have to really roll up our sleeves and start getting a lot more systematic in our process, including lots of sense-making processes and deeper, even more credible impact and outcomes. And we're going to come back to this a little bit, but principle number one is be very clear with everyone about the purpose of the assessment. Number two is the need to accept the imperfection of poverty reduction measures. So when we started Opportunities 2000 in 1996, and it ran from 1997 to 2000, we wrestled with this issue right away when we were in Waterloo Region. And we came to the conclusion pretty quickly that there is no one right definition of poverty, and there's no one right agreed upon set of metrics. It's a highly, highly contested space, and we'll talk about that shortly. And it defies simple measurement. So this urge to nail measurement before you proceed, drop that image or that urge. It ain't going to happen. It just is not going to happen in a complex community. It's very hard to agree on the working definition of poverty, never mind the poverty reduction measurements you might want to use. So we are going to be using blunt and primitive imperfect instruments. And here's a couple of things just from I gathered in the paper the week we were putting this together. Bill Gates tweets out a chart about poverty and he gets everyone reacting to it because they're saying, well, that's not poverty and that's not the right measurement. The UK is struggling with the new poverty measure because they're not satisfied with their last one. In Africa, I forgot where the Daily Star is from, I think it's Nigeria, Ministry of Human Development is looking at a new poverty reduction measure, and so is our federal government. So, highly contested space. There is no right answer, there are simply choices about what measurement framework to use. Why is that? You've seen this framework, this quote many of you before. Poverty's got a constellations of causes and effects. I'm going to read this again. A rundown apartment can exacerbate a child's asthma, which leads to a call for an ambulance, which generates a bill that cannot be paid, which ruins a credit record, which hikes the interest rate on an auto loan, which forces the purchase of an unreliable used car, which jeopardizes the mother's punctuality at work, which limits her promotions and earning capacity, which defines her for housing. This is a very tightly coupled mix of causes and effects that is difficult to understand and varies from person to person. So when you zoom out and you'd say, well, how do we measure this overall in a community, never mind a person? Here's all the stuff you begin to deal with. You've got these different causes and effects, the different dimensions of poverty. We have the different types of poverty, and this is taken from the Tamarack Poverty Matrix, which came out of Opportunities 2000 in Waterloo. There's a difference between being at risk of poor. There's a difference with being working poor. There's a difference when you're temporarily unemployed, persistently unemployed, dependent poor, homeless, etc. What if we throw demographics into this and we'd say the poverty experience and the measurement and the strategies of a senior couple on a fixed income in Winnipeg are different than a recent immigrant from Syria who's driving cab but has a doctor's degree, is different from a homeless youth in Victoria who's run away from a bad family situation. Geography makes a difference. Ethnocultural worldview, it's very difficult, even we just did some stuff in Calgary to get an Indigenous understanding of what poverty means. And everyone's also got their own political and personal opinions. So this is not to depress you, everyone. This is simply to say this is so complex that there is no right one answer. There are, however, intervention level measurement frameworks and population level ones, which we'll return to later on, that are blunt, primitive, but that reveal some insight around poverty that we might be able to use as measurement. Some of them include self-sufficiency scales, deprivation indexes, sustainable livelihood, social determinants of wealth, health, as long, of course, as the simple income-based measures such as LIM, LICO, and MBM. At the population level measure frameworks, again, we have those basic income level measures. There's also deprivation indices being developed in different places. The federal government's got an emerging poverty dashboard. We're not entirely clear what that's going to include yet, but it's an income-based measure plus more. And there's also the Canadian Index of Well-Being that some people have an affinity for. No matter what we choose, though, it is an imperfect representation of the complexity of poverty. They are at best roughly right. Actually, Hamilton wrestled with this a long time ago, and they came up with a very nice way of doing this, where they actually chose to track simply income as their proxy for poverty levels. And their phrase was, poverty is much, much more than a lack of income, but it always includes a lack of income as a key challenge. So they made a rationale to say, this is our blunt way of understanding progress. You will make your own choices. Principle number 3, that might be what we're learning about impact, how to measure poverty reduction at different scales. We also have to make a decision about what is an outcome. And for the purposes of getting your report done, we're arguing that align your results or your outcomes to your plan and create an outcome results framework that mimics your plan. Let me give you a quick example of that. End Poverty Edmonton's got a great plan. Their definition of poverty is stated on the slide here. Edmontonians experience poverty when they lack or are denied economic, social, and cultural resources to have a quality of life that sustains and facilitates full and meaningful participation in the community. It's a very good definition. It's quite difficult to imagine how to track that at a community-wide level as a measurement system. That's why Edmonton is having to make its own choices about what the impact measures are. But they do have very concrete things in their plan around game changers and priority areas. So you can see these: racism, incomes, housing, transit, childcare, health services. Many of you have the same mix, same ingredients in your own plan, and they also have 28 priority areas that somewhat overlap with this. What we'll argue, what you'll see in the rest of the series is we're going to ask you to treat these priority areas as your outcome areas, where if you make progress on these, they will make a contribution to overall impact on poverty. So that's principle number 3. Principle number 4 is an easy one. You can't measure everything, and it's just going to create noise and confusion. And you need, and we all need, to prioritize our measurement. Some things have to be more important than others. Other things have to recede into the background. So what are the impacts and the outcomes that we most want to measure, and why? And which ones might we want to measure if we had the time and energy to do it, and why would we do that? This will at least be able to help us to focus whatever you put in your plan, because particularly if you're doing your plan, you're getting the impact report for the first year, you may not be able to measure it all. You want to start on the things that are mission critical and most important, and the workbook you'll see has some questions around that. Principle number 5, focus on mixed methods. The shorthand for this is no narratives without numbers and no numbers without narratives. It's very difficult to understand impact without qualitative and quantitative data alone, and we need mixed methods. There's a phrase called two-eyed seeing, and it comes from Eastern Canada in I think Mi'kmaq culture. I forgot the elder's name, who he uses to talk about looking at the world through a Western lens and an Indigenous lens, particularly around ecological restoration. But I think the same idea applies here. Qualitative data deals with things like, well, qualitative stuff, insight, meaning, depth. Quantitative data gives us patterns and trends and a clumsy understanding of intensity and depth. And both of those things together provide a more rich picture of what's going on. Let me give you 2 quick examples of that. Let's zoom in and zoom out with methods for poverty reduction in the rural Philippines. I worked for the UN for a while, and I saw a presentation once on agricultural reform in the Philippines. This was in the early 90s. Probably is the best presentation I've ever seen on an evaluation. And what they did is they started off with a qualitative story, the life of the Jimenez family pre-agricultural reforms. And they did a qualitative analysis. It was a case study. Here's the family. Here's what their morning looks like. They have to get up at 5 to go to so and such a place to get water. The kids can't go to school until 10, and they only make 3 days a week because they have to work in the fields. I'm forgetting the details of that, but And the father is quite anxious because he feels this is the first generation in his family that won't be able to finish school. They give the qualitative, the meaningful understanding of what poverty is like in this family pre-reforms. Then they go into describing all the reforms, and they have lots of reforms to talk about, and they had lots of statistics. They had pretty good visual maps about, look at all the land that's irrigated, look at all the land that's been transferred from this landowning class to those lower income peasant classes, etc. And they did a terrific job of providing metrics. And then what they did is to say, so what now? What does all of that mean? They went back to the Jimenez family post-reforms, and they said, well, here are some numbers. They now make, $800 more a month, or whatever the dollar, the currency was. But the kids now go to school 5 times a week. The father's less anxious. They've got running water, etc. So that's just, I don't think what we're saying here is counterintuitive, but it is countercultural because we focus on metrics all the time. This is just one example to say we could use both. Let me give you another one. This is an evaluation I read many years ago, and I haven't been able to find it. And it's, again, it's too bad. It was sort of pre-web. I'm from a pre-web era. And it was tracking the experience of people, consumers of the mental health system, or survivors of the mental health system. They were called consumers at that point, who had left mental health service, not really left, but were involved in social enterprises where they were delivering courier services and restaurants, etc. Social enterprise was got really big in the mid-90s, and now it's big again. And what they did is they actually did surveys where they got quantitative follow-up, 2-year follow-up studies, reading files, surveys, and interviews, and used a mix of quantitative and qualitative data to generate the following insights: that they had 3 different stories of what people would experience going through those enterprises. Fulfilled expectations, and this was roughly a quarter, and one half of the 1/4, that means 1/8, actually had incomes above the low income cutoff line, thanks to working in these social enterprises. But their entire story was, I like going to work, the money is helpful, I exited social assistance, I made friends, etc. This was a good deal for me, this social enterprise. A little under half had partially fulfilled stories. They like the work relationships, they get stressed at times because of the workload, the money is good, but it's not enough to pay the bills, etc. So some things were good, some things were not so good. It was a mixed bag. Then they had unfulfilled expectations, and these were unfulfilled stories, and they made just enough money to leave social assistance, but that cut them off from the DREAD program. They're more stressed than they were, and they were, etc. They just thought this program actually was worse for me than it was better. Now, this is important because this is actually a more accurate picture of what's going on in the program, rather than we serve 75,000 people on this, like the McDonald's approach to evaluation. 300 people ate our hamburgers, 400 people went through our doors. But it's also another illustration of the power of using both metrics and qualitative information to get a more fulsome understanding of what's going on. So let's treat that as a high-level principle. No narratives without numbers, no numbers without narratives. Let's go on to principle number 6. This is the one that I know you all feel, because I certainly felt it when I was the coordinator of Opportunities 2000 from 97 to 2000. Often when you see evaluation tools and techniques, they assume that you have control to design whatever techniques you use, and all those people who need to gather the techniques will like your design, will like your metrics, will gather the data for you and deliver it to you on time. But what we know is that when you are coordinating these things as conveners and backbones and intermediaries, you actually have a span of control that varies quite a bit. Sometimes you can control the intervention. I like to call them build and drive. You can then therefore control the methods and data. Sometimes you collaborate in the intervention. I like to call these support and amplify. You influence the methods and data that people might use, but you can't tell them to use it. You kind of encourage them. You get some things you want, and other things you just have to scrape together what they give you and try and create a story out of that. The third one is you support the intervention from a distance, or you just watch it. I like to call these stamp and brands. You stamp and brand it. There's a poverty reduction effort. We love it. It's supporting what we're doing, but we don't control any of it. And you have almost no control of what they provide. this is the reality of what it's like in your position. This is the reality of what it's like for you to gather and analyze data and trying like crazy to create a coherent story. And so what we want to do is to normalize this, not to pretend that you can have perfect instruments and methods and then everyone is going to hop in line for you, because it ain't going to happen. Here's a quick example of this. When I'm going to use this from Opportunities 2000, we ran something back then. We had $1 million some to invest in local poverty reduction projects. We called it the Local Investment Poverty Reduction Fund. And this was largely through nonprofit organizations, and we generated good projects for that project. There was pet hunting service for the working poor. There was one of Canada's first savings and financial literacy programs. There was a lot of cool initiatives that went through there. But because we were the funder, our control was really high. And we got people to use our methods, including the follow-up data on income increases, thanks to those projects from participating families. On the other hand, there was a group of businesses that created a book called The 10 Things Your Company Can Do to Reduce Poverty. And they were arm's length, and it was businesses talking to businesses. So business A would talk to business B. It was the Chambers of Commerce. It was the United Ways. All of these groups were involved. We didn't control any of that. And in fact, because we were using, our major instrument was the one we were using for the agencies doing poverty reduction projects for our fund, we got nothing. In fact, and this was a problem because the business stories were actually better than our nonprofit stories. There was one business who reported simply looking at the book, and they increased the income rates for 12 different positions, not 12 different people, 12 different positions in their company, simply when they found out what the real low-income cutoff line was. So we lost all of that data simply because we weren't ready to give up the use of our single instrument. What we should have done was to create, try and gather whatever data we could to tell a coherent outcome story. We should have put together a patchwork of data. I'm going to quote Brenda Zimmerman here, who left us 4 or 5 years ago, and this is a big thing to keep in mind. It's almost impossible to get consistency of data on measuring of complex issues, but you can strive to get coherency, and that's what we're shooting for. Principle number 7, we're doing good for pace here, everyone. Match the methods to the capacity of the group, and make sure that everyone knows that you're doing the best you can with what you got. There's lots of ways of thinking about this, and we've created a simplified version of it, and this might be oversimplistic, but at least it's a good start, where we talk about at least 3 levels of capacity. Again, this is made up. There's no one right way of doing this, but this illustrates different levels of capacity. You might be a convener with very few full-time equivalent staff, 1 to 2 or even half-time, very little budget and little to no evaluation experience. What we'd ask you to do in that case is strive to at least describe the rationale for your different interventions, maybe use existing evidence on likely outcomes and impact. I'm going to show you an example of that right away, and at least describe the key activities and outputs. So basic monitoring. What would that do? It would point to plausible outcomes and impact. It is plausible that these things will happen, but you don't have enough energy or resources or expertise to go demonstrate that. What if you're a level 2 group and you've got more full-time staff, you got an evaluation budget, and you got a little bit of expertise? This would include doing the stuff that we just talked about in level 1, but also jumping in a little bit, rolling up your sleeves, and using a couple methods to gather new evidence on outcomes and impact, and even engage stakeholders in that process. And you'll see some of this show up in the modules that we have coming up after this one. If we did that, we could point to the likelihood of outcomes and impact, but we couldn't demonstrate it, but we're getting a little bit of data that demonstrates that it's likely. What if you're level 3, and again, all artificial, but you've got more staff, you've got a good evaluation budget, you might even have an evaluation coordinator? Well, we'd ask you to do level 1 and level 2 stuff, and we would ask you to use more sophisticated forms of analysis and even create diverse evaluation teams. And you'll see that again come up in some of the modules coming up. If we did that, you could point to probable outcomes and impact, or even well demonstrated outcomes and impact. What does that mean? I'm going to give a quick example of that. Many of you do poverty simulations, which are interactive exercises to increase people's insight and empathy into the nature of poverty, and hopefully encourage them to be able to act on it. Well, let's pretend we got 3 different organizations, each of them doing a poverty simulation. A level 1 organization might simply do this. Hey, here's why we did the poverty simulation. This is what it's meant to do, generate insight and empathy. Here is our reach. We had 300 people come to 2 different sessions. And here, by the way, is what past research says is likely to happen. And if you Google this a little bit, there's already existing evidence base that says if you run a poverty simulation, here's probably what is likely to happen. Now, when we can get this information, this is really good because it means you don't have to keep reproving stuff that's already been somewhat demonstrated. And we know from research that poverty simulations, if done well, are almost always successful in generating insight and empathy into poverty. But the research shows that it doesn't by itself lead to greater action on poverty. People don't then do something. You need other things to help them to do. So it's a good appetizer, but it's not enough. It's not enough of a dosage to make them do anything. So you could say, here's what we think is going to happen based on past research and what we think we're doing and why. You had a little bit more capacity. You might do some follow-up interviews with people, maybe not all of them, with some participants, and describe what changed for them. You might do methods, case studies, methods, key informant interviews, and saying, we got a bit of extra stuff. Here's what people told us 6 months after the interview, 6 months after the poverty simulation. The third one is, what if you follow people for a couple years, found out how their perceptions have changed, and seen what actions, if any, they've taken. Now that's a lot more effort, and you might decide that's not remotely worth it, and you would be able to make that decision. But at a level 3 capacity, you could do that kind of deeper dive and point to probable outcomes and impact. So again, you may disagree with the versions of how we describe level 1, 2, and 3, and have different ways of thinking about the method and example, but you get the idea. Match the level of methods to your capacity, and let's make sure that everyone knows about them. Natasha, I'm just going to stop here for a break in the process because we have about 5 more principles to go. But as we walk through this, any reflections on your part about what this reveals to you about how some of the communities have been doing their poverty reduction evaluation so far?
I think some of the impact reports or the annual reports that we've seen so far already incorporate some of these principles. Maybe not all of them, to the extent that you're talking about. There's always room for improvement, but I think some of these core principles are already there, and we're already seeing at some of our events and in our communities of practice, and people talking about moving in this direction as well.
Yeah, I agree, Natasha. And when we were preparing this, I think one of the things we said is maybe this could be helpful in simply making them more explicit, and we could be more disciplined in manifesting them when we're doing our reports. So this was just a strengthening of, rather than dramatically introducing new information.
Mm-hmm. And that's really what the workbook is meant to do too, with the different reflection questions that we have around and the resources that we've put together around each of these principles, is really to help refine, like we have this idea about narratives and numbers. Now, how do we start applying that to our work? How do we use this in our next annual report?
And as we get to that workbook, I think the team did a really good job of looking at each of these principles and saying, you don't have a lot of homework, but most of those exercises are sensitizing exercises, just to get people warmed up to these principles and to see to what degree they're comfortable with them or not. So that workbook is not finish this workbook, the principle set of exercises, and you've got a plan. It's get ready for the content that's about to come, keeping these principles in mind. Yeah. Well, let's go to principle number 8. We're on the tail end of it here. I don't even know if this is framed the right way. And Natasha, you and I were playing with this, so this might evolve over time. But when it comes to choosing methods and indicators, everyone, there's really only 3 choices in front of you. You either adopt an existing set of methods and indicators, you adapt an existing set of methods and indicators, or you build from scratch, build your own. And each of them have strengths and limitations. Now, almost everyone prefers, and I know many of you on the call will agree, just show me a method and a tool and let me use it like a recipe. Well, we all want that, but when it actually comes down to looking at methods and indicators for others, it's almost always slightly disappointing because they ask things in a different way than we would. They use different language. It's too big or it's too small, and it never perfectly fits our situation, and that's simply unavoidable. Like there are no recipes in this world, but sometimes you find ones that work. Other times you don't. You'd say, I like that method or that set of indicators, but it doesn't perfectly work, so let's adapt it a little bit. That's really relatively inexpensive to do, but it does require some expertise and resources. And not long ago, I was working with an Indigenous organization who was asked, who was doing crime prevention stuff, and they were asked to use a survey that was developed and tested and validated and determined to be reliable around resiliency. And they had a terrific questionnaire about that. So the questionnaire was excellent. And when the group looked at the questionnaire, one of the things was, do you go to the gym or the physical recreation facility on a regular basis? And someone said, our facility is a portable and it's in disrepair and it's got mold. No one, it's not even relevant to our community, that question. So the essence was, do you access physical activities or engage them regularly? But the specific question was so highly tuned towards kids in the city and the urban landscape that it didn't work. So what the group did, they took the general format of questions, but they adapted them to reflect the reality of working in rural Indigenous communities. So that's an example of adapt. Sometimes you say, look, I want to use some methods and indicators, but there's nothing out there and you have to build them from scratch. Now, that is most likely to capture your unique impact and outcomes, but it simply takes time, money, and sometimes expertise to do well. It's not easy to do it. It's not even easy sometimes to do a good survey. Some people can whip it together, and something is better than nothing, but it's a bit more work, and that's simply the price to pay for building your own. So principle number 8 is just be clear that when you're choosing methods and indicators, you've got these 3 generic options. They each have strengths and limitations. Just be aware of what you're picking and why. Actually, here's 2 real quick examples. I gave one. I love Calgary Homelessness Foundation, their management information system, as an example of building a new information system. This is actually one of the greatest examples of shared measurement in Canada. The foundation is very disciplined. There's lots of bumps and bruises in developing and implementing this, but it also took a hell of a long time, and it cost a lot of money. And it costs money to keep people providing good data. So that's an example of build. Here's another example of build. Cod fisheries in Newfoundland. Andy Rowe, who's an evaluator at the national level, he was using both metrics that Canadian fisheries were using on cod stocks, but they also created and adopted and adapted an additional one to complement those existing indicators. And that was something called catch and release. And that was when the cod fishery was really good. At one point, the time it took for you to catch what your limit was, so you could use that for personal use, like bring it home for supper. It used to be, and I'm making this up, I don't know the number. It used to be an hour. That's not the right number. But then when the cod fisheries went down, it turned out to be like 10 hours before you could get your personal use because the cod fisheries were so low. And one of the tracking mechanisms is, as the cod fishery recovers, and it has recovered a bit, does it take you now 9 hours, 6 hours, 4 hours, 3 hours? And that was a proxy indicator that they created on the spot, but complemented the other existing indicators and methods that people were using. Principle number 9, last 3 of them, estimate contribution. This is pretty heady stuff, folks, and this actually is one of the most complex things do an evaluation, and all we're going to do is introduce a paradigm and then learn how to use that paradigm in each of the subsequent models. Attribution says, let's try and find out to what extent our intervention caused the change and to prove that link, and probably feel pressure to use experimental design as the gold standard, randomized controlled trials. We can't use randomized controlled trials, and number 1. And number 2, it's not even a helpful question in citywide poverty reduction efforts to talk about attribution. We want to know about contribution. a wide angle lens. We know there's multiple reasons changes happen. We are only one of them. So we want to know the extent to which we contributed to change, and not to prove it conclusively, but to create a plausible link that what we did generated that contribution. And we want to be able to use whatever methods we have in front of us to even get to that answer. To what degree did we contribute to this? We will see that time and time again in the next modules pop up, but we are saying no to attribution and yes to contribution. I'm not going to give you these case studies. They'll come up when we talk about them, but we've got, even in Opportunities 2000, from 97 to 2000, we use contribution analysis scales to talk about expansion of housing and social assistance programs. And there's relatively straight, lightweight versions of how to do that, mostly organized around something called stakeholder estimate. We'll explore that in the next module. Principles number 10, 11, and 12. I'm going to just give you a story here. When you get a sense of progress using hard and soft data, that is something, but the question is, so what does it mean? What is value about this, or how do we judge the change? The vignette I want to share with you is in about 8 years ago, a woman named Jess Dart, who created the most significant change technique, was in a rural Indonesian village, again, doing an evaluation of an agricultural reform program that had a big emphasis on gender empowerment. And she was speaking with an older lady, an elder of the village, on a Thursday afternoon, and the story went something like this. So what has changed for you pre-post these reforms? She talked for a long time, and then Jesse asked the translator to say, so can you confirm again what was changed? And the woman said, well, every Friday I now walk 10 miles to this meeting. I sit in the meeting, I listen, I think, and then I don't say anything, and I walk 10 miles home. So you think, well, what's the point of that? That's a change. It's a change, but we don't know what's meaningful about it. So she said, why is that significant for you? And the elder said, in the history of this region, no woman has ever been allowed to go to that meeting. It was verboten. That was just for men. And now, because of this agricultural reform, I get to go, and my friends get to go. And then the last question was, so if you were to give this a title in a newspaper article, what would you call it? And she said, next time we're going to say something. Now, that's a very dramatic version of what does it mean to make meaning. When you generate outcomes and you report them, if you don't give it, assess value and significance and help people answer the question, so what? They will do it themselves. So you have a choice. How do you judge outcomes? And we're going to talk about these 5 different ways. Are things better than they were? To what degree are we achieving some kind of pre-established goal? How do we compare against others? How does our stuff, it shouldn't be compare against peers. Standard should be, how do we compare against the standard? And we'll talk about that later. And how do diverse stakeholders value the change? By the way, value is the core word of evaluation. It's not measurement, it's to value something. Measurement is simply a means to an end. Last 2, to make appropriate claims. When we generate data on impact and outcomes and impact, we actually have to make claims about them, and we should be awfully careful about what we claim and not. So if we're simply holding on and barely able to map the outcomes or the likely and plausible outcomes, that's what we should say. We should have in our report, this is how we track this stuff. We have an impression of the kinds of outcomes that are likely to emerge and how we contribute to them. We shouldn't go into marketing mode. The moment we do, people start to sniff that out, and the world is full of people marketing something, everything to everyone, and we will lose credibility. So we really have to say, here's what the outcomes are, and here's how confident we are in what we're about to say, and not to overclaim. That's going to come up big and strong in module number 6. Finally, the last principle, and we'll turn it over to you. Prepare yourself for long-term iterative process of learning by doing. We can, in this process, can share some knowledge and insights about the complex nature of tracking change and poverty reduction efforts and create coherency about it in a way that allows you to adapt these things to your unique context, but knowledge doesn't mean skills. It just simply takes time to keep learning how to do this by thinking with your hands. The more you do it, the more you'll feel comfortable with it, the more you'll be able to produce stuff that you're confident in. There's almost no chance that you're going to nail this in the first time. It is a journey of relentless incrementalism. So welcome to the journey, everyone. Those are the 12 principles. We should have maybe had a slide that summarized them all. They're going to pop up time and time again in the next modules, but in the spirit of the cart not preceding the horse, where the horse is perspectives and principles, and the cart is methods, indicators, and techniques, we hope that we gave you a fairly good and quick impressionistic understanding of the horse that's meant to lead us through these next 5 modules. Natasha, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. That was lots to take in, 12 principles. And as Mark said, not something that we're asking you all to rush back and get exactly right now. These are things that we're hoping that you start thinking about, start talking about with your roundtable members, with your evaluation team, with whoever's working with these on you, so that like we're on the same page, and that you have some inkling, kind of a plan as you're walking through the rest of the different modules and creating those indicators and your report. So why don't we get a sense of how those 12 principles are settling with you? Is there anything that stood out to you as, absolutely, we're already doing this? Anything that was really surprising and you think, oh, this makes so much sense, we haven't been doing this, we should be doing this? Or is there anything that stands out to you as, I don't know if we're able to do this, this is going to be a huge challenge for us? If you'll bear with us, this is a new system.
I enjoyed doing this, actually. I like trying to think about what was most mission critical for us to keep in mind as a storyline for all of you doing your work. And I'm going to quote, many of you have heard this before, so I use it in different formats, but Jay Connor uses this metaphor when asked what's the difference between a good movie and a bad movie. In community change efforts. When Francis Ford Coppola was asked what was the difference between a good movie and a bad movie, and he says, oh, it's easy. In a good movie, because everyone's making the same movie. And Jay Connor used that metaphor to confirm that in community change efforts, like poverty reduction, part of the challenge of work like yours is you got to make sure we're all making the same movie. And the plan is meant to be sort of a plot line, and there's a lot of improv within there, but you're constantly trying to get people aligned on the same general storyline. And I think it's the same, it's echoed in the evaluation work. And what this is meant to do is to say, these are at least 12 different principles that we can refer to and touch to make sure on the evaluation side, we're making the same movie. And the one that actually resonated with me most of all of this, they all did in different ways, was that idea of our job is to create a coherent story from a patchwork of data. And that's such a relief because evaluation is so geeky. And I'm a geek, so I get it, I like it. But it's so precise, and this idea of consistency and clarity, etc., that it actually is paradoxical to think there's moments where you have that precision and that clarity, etc., on specific projects and specific evaluations. But when you zoom out and do what you're doing, your job as a convener is to tell a coherent story. People are going to get lost, and they need someone to keep talking about the movie and what's happening in the movie and where we're making progress. And all you have is this patchwork of data that requires coherency building. Sometimes you get to gather what you like, and sometimes you don't. And boy, when we were doing Opportunities 2000 from 97 to 2000, I really wish we would have really felt that in our bones. We would have been so much better simply by accepting that mandate rather than pretending we were traditional evaluators and everything had to be evaluated in a certain way that met some kind of academic standards. I just really wish we could rewind the clock and do that. So that principle for me was the most powerful.
Mm-hmm. It gives permission. There's a lot of people that I think who are in that first line, Mark, with 1 to 2, maybe even not 1 to 2 people who are going to be working on this evaluation, in addition to doing lots of other pieces of the poverty reduction strategy and the poverty reduction work itself.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, let's go back to the chat.
So, yeah, it was very interesting. I just wanted to talk about, so we do use, well, I'm in Winnipeg.
Yeah.
We do use mixed methods,
Yeah.
and we kind of figure them out as we're going, basically. Like, for example, we might take a group of job seekers to tour a few job sites, and on the way back we might do interviews of them to see what they thought about it, what was helpful, that kind of thing. But I worry about the rigor piece. Like, if we're just creating as we go along, how do we also at the same time ensure, like, how do we track it, for one thing, because there is a lot going on, and then how do we ensure rigor, and how can we claim, like, on the scale of plausibility, probability, at what point can you claim that when you're doing that kind of, make it up as you go kind of?
Yeah,
that's sort of my question.
Eric, it raises two good points. And one, you surfaced something that, by the way, Erica and others, just a confirmation, this is the first time we've done this series, so we feel pretty good with this content we presented you as opening moves. But we're going to interact with you on this, both on the webinars and in behind the scenes with the workbook and coaching. So you're going to surface stuff that just helps us continue to adapt. So I want to use this as an example. Erica, you raised a point that we kind of thought about, but we didn't know if it was worth putting in. And in the end, it didn't make it onto the list, but maybe it should. There's something about a debate about what is credible evidence and what is actionable evidence. And the challenge is we often are in a field where there's something called the hierarchy of evidence, which is many academics and professional evaluators use, where it has at the very top randomized controlled trials, on the very bottom participant observations, etc. And what it says is it's highly influenced by the pharmaceutical industry, where you were doing scientific investigations. And there's a very big debate in the field about if that's appropriate for everything. Some people actually call it, they call it research imperialism, colonialism, to say that's not the only way of looking at it. And there's an alternative way called fit for purpose and actionable evidence. Given what you're trying to do at what point in time, can you, what is fit for purpose actionable evidence? And I think maybe we should be able to refer to that, because if you're doing real-time feedback and you've got a small-scale initiative, fit for purpose is you're not going to do a randomized control trial, right? On that, you're going to bring together different levels of evidence to help you make certain decisions. So we could probably introduce that a little bit more clearly, so we don't always feel wanting, like we're always 1,000 miles from the most robust evidence. The second one is a thing I wanted to mention related to that, Erica, was it's actually an expansion or an extension of this idea of a patchwork of data. So many of you know Michael Quinn Patton. I think he's the best evaluator in the English language world. He's worked on yet another 2 books. And he uses this phrase quite a bit. He says, when we're doing evaluation, we're all bricoleurs, which comes from the French bricolage. And he says, what that means, a bricoleur is a handy person who would roam the French countryside and just fix things up with whatever tools and materials were available, right? Fix a shelf with some wood and some ropes or whatever. And the challenge was, it was an art because you did what you could with what you had. Other people call the modern version of that to be MacGyver, right? Take what you got and work your way through a situation. This relates to the fit for purpose idea, and it relates to the idea of putting together a patchwork of things. The best we can do is be bricoleurs, do our bloody best with what we have right in front of us. That is the new gold standard. And the question is, if, let's say, Erica, you were doing, you were deciding on that job program after all those interviews that you did with people on the way home from the job site, that you created an intervention that you thought deserved a pilot, you would have to then say, we're about to make some high stakes decision where our evidence burden goes through the roof. In that case, you'd say, that's our challenge. We may not be able to generate the evidence we want to, but then we'll simply acknowledge that we're making big decisions based on imperfect data, and we're making our decisions or claims simply carefully. So do the best we can with what we got and don't overclaim. That's all we can do in these situations.
And it looks like we might have 2 more questions that if we can address in maybe 1 minute each.
Sure.
Gary and folks in Sault Ste. Marie, did you have a question? I see your hand is up.
Similar to the other one, accepting the imperfection of poverty impact measures, and it's not really a question, it's just a comment. You know, we struggle with one of the things, one of the outcomes that we're looking at is people having their immediate needs met. And so there are a number of measures that we have that we can track, and we do track in order to determine that. But there's a lot of overlap because people accessing one service also access multiple services. So, you know, there's always the struggle of, is that number right? But, you know, when you accept the imperfection, then you say it's okay, because when you see those numbers in general going down, you know you have an improvement. So I am supported by those comments in this presentation.
Yeah, it's a great, thank you, Gary. That's a great conclusion to draw, that they're blunt and primitive indicators. I mean, that's what really the word indicate means. It doesn't mean it's real. It means it's an indication of a direction or a trend or a pattern. And so if you'd said, here's an imperfect measure for the following reasons, and you told the world that, and you'd say, but we're going to use it as a proxy, that's really demonstrating several of the principles in this document. You might even also say, and in order to confirm how imperfect it is, not only are we going to track and report the measure, but we might follow a couple archetypical people and tell their story in depth, or even if they're personas, like they're just illustrative of the others, to show here's the overall needle moving, but here's what it looks like in a couple of real persons' lives. That takes in the mixed methods approach, and it gives the narrative to the numbers. So you'd look at the needle and go, what does that mean? And you could say, well, here's what it means in depth. Now zoom out and just get a rough sense of the direction of the story. But the narratives give you a slightly deeper sense of it. Now, why would you do that? Because I think part of the challenge of telling the stories, particularly around awareness building, is we want to build insight and empathy in our communities. When we communicate stuff, we want people to give a rip about this and to feel the nuances of this. So I think it's a great conclusion, Gary, and I think you're manifesting several of the principles in the framework.
Great, thank you.
So we've had lots of support in the chat box by people saying, you know, some of these principles are speaking to them. The one around prioritizing measurement, including a why or a so what, weaving together the patchwork of data, and accepting imperfection of measures, even though we're avoiding accepting it, and often trying to create a line of sight for everything. So thank you everyone for participating today. I see there's one more question that we weren't able to get to, and Mark, maybe I'll leave this. We're going to create an FAQ so that, you know, as we go through this, as you bring these questions back to your tables, you work through them. We will be checking in with you as your managers of cities, and we can bring up the questions too that are coming from each of your tables. You know, we have extra questions about this or that, or need more resources. We'll create an FAQ each time so that you can come back to see what some of the other people are talking about. We can pull more resources for you and continue having the discussion even when we're not online together. So with that, why don't we move into just a couple of closing announcements. Okay. Mark, if you go to the next slide. As I mentioned before, you have module 1 now. We've walked through it. Your homework is now to go back and look through each of those principles, do the reflective questions in there, with your team, whether that's one other person, you know, the person who's joining you on these calls, whether you have an evaluation team, or you actually want feedback from the entire roundtable. Go do these questions with your team. We will reach out to you as your VC team to schedule a check-in with you. Probably, you know, we prefer for after you have this conversation with your team so that we can work through some of your questions and challenges with you and talk about next steps. We will be sending you today's recording as well as the meeting resources again. And then we will meet back here on April 25th from 1 to 2 for the next module, looking at shifting awareness and creating will and buy-in. So that's all for today. Thank you everybody for joining us and for asking some great questions. We will be in touch with you again shortly.
Thanks, everybody.